Hi, this is Vaibhav Purandare here, and my new video is about why Japan does not have a regular military and whether things could change in the wake of former ruler Shinzo Abe's assassination. Before the outbreak of World War II in 1939, Japan was quite aggressive. It was Imperial Japan at the time, not a democracy, and it went about acquiring territories in its neighborhood. It acquired Manchuria in the east of China, which was quite a big region in China's east. And it acquired some other parts in China as well. When the World War broke out, Japan joined Germany and the Axis powers. And the Allied powers were against it. What I'm going to talk about from now on is the context of the Japan-US relations at the time, because those are very critical to understanding why Japan does not have a military at all. So before World War II, as Japan had gone about acquiring territories, relations between the United States and Japan deteriorated considerably. The United States tried to punish Imperial Japan by cutting off trade, by cutting off any other kinds of interactions or relationships. And it helped China because China was under attack from Japan. At the same time, negotiations were on to ensure that there was some sort of peace between the two countries, and things did not get to a point where armed hostilities broke out. Now, Japan had not entered World War II until 1941, until the very end of 1941. While these negotiations for peace were going on, towards the end of 1941, the Japanese forces suddenly attacked Pearl Harbor. Now, Pearl Harbor is in the Hawaiian Islands in the Pacific Ocean. About 200 Japanese planes, one fine morning, descended on Pearl Harbor, attacked it from the air, hurling bombs, torpedoing ships there, strafing and attacking, firing in various ways possible. The devastation was massive. 2,300 American soldiers died in that attack by Japan. It was a completely surprise attack, and the United States was taken totally unawares. This attack by Japan ensured that America got into World War II. And from then on, Germany was already facing difficulties in Soviet Russia, and Stalin was pushing back. Stalin and his forces were pushing back. So with Stalin as part of the Allied effort and the United States also getting into the war, we know that Germany, of course, was defeated, but Japan was decisively defeated as well. And there happened the horrific nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, and Japan surrendered in August 1945. After the surrender, Japan was under Allied occupation for quite a few years, and in 1947, the Japanese constitution was drawn up in agreement with the Americans, who were largely in command in Japan at that time. Included in that Japanese constitution was Article 9. Article 9 of the Japanese constitution says, as it was framed in 1947, that Japan renounces war as a sovereign right and agrees that it will not use force as an instrument in sorting out any international disputes. And in order to ensure that this promise of Japan is fulfilled, it will not have any forces military forces on land, in the air, or in the sea. This meant that the Japanese had lost all the right to have an armed military. Now the Japanese altogether weren't against it at all, because the Japanese were accused of all kinds of horrific crimes during World War II, crimes against China, crimes against Korea, especially southern Korea. And the Japanese also wanted to come to terms with their history and acknowledge a lot of that sordid past, like Germany acknowledged after World War II the horrors of the Nazi regime. So the Japanese people were also ready to recognize that some horrors had happened during Imperial Japan's expansionist rule, and they wanted some corrective measures to happen, and they took a certain pride in the fact that they were really drawing up a pacifist constitution. Of course, there were elements in Japan which were opposed to it, which said that America was trying to indirectly control Japan and dictate terms to it. But on the whole, the Japanese population wholeheartedly welcomed this move, and as we know, in the later decades, Japan started focusing largely on its development and on the rebuilding of the nation, which had suffered these two horrific nuclear bomb strikes and lost in World War II. Now, when did some sort of rethink start happening on whether Japan should have a military force or not? In fact, the rethink started happening immediately after World War II. And that rethink was because of primarily reasons of how the security environment had changed in the neighborhood. While Russia was part of the Allied effort in World War II, Stalin was soon recognized as a threat to democracy, and the Soviet Union had this great iron curtain and was not seen as a very secure neighbor or a very responsible neighbor or force in the world. At the same time, China turned in the direction of communism when the nationalists there were defeated in 1949 and the communists took over. So the Soviet Russia, the Soviet Union and China now suddenly were both threats, and it was by no means certain that in the eastern parts everything would be peaceful. Now Japan had agreed in the early 1950s to keep American forces on its soil, so that if somebody attacked Japan, America could defeat it. These forces could defeat it. And America agreed to defend Japan in the face of an assault. But things kept changing in the neighborhood, and especially in the last 20 years, as the new century started, the rethink on the issue grew bigger. Now that was because China started showing a lot of expansionist designs and started claiming islands in the East China Sea, which is the sea between Japan and China, and in the South China Sea, which is further to the south between Japan and China. And it was by no means certain that Japan was secure, and the need began to be felt for Japan to have a military force. Now, did Japan have absolutely nothing for all these decades? No. Here we must talk about what is called as a self-defense force. Now, Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, which spoke about not having an active military, was interpreted by the Japanese government and also by the Supreme Court of Japan to mean that Japan could nevertheless have a self-defense force. So Japan had started building up a self-defense force, and initially the force was of the size of 1,50,000, and the force was only meant to repel an attack if it happened. It was not meant to carry out any aggressive strike on its own. It could only defend. Now that force is in excess of 2,50,000, which may appear substantial if you look at it as an isolated number, but if you look at 2,50,000, in comparison with the forces of even say a South Korea or China's forces, then it is much less in number. It's quite insignificant, in fact. But Japan had, as a matter of fact, built this self-defense force. And Shinzo Abe's party, the Democratic Liberals in Japan, began to increasingly press for an amendment to the constitution to ensure that Japan had an active military and a regular military force to fight its conflicts. So that if somebody attacked Japan, they could hit back and not merely defend. Now, their reasoning was like this: China was getting very aggressive, North Korea was a danger, and if a conflict broke out in the Far East and in that region, then Japan needed to look after its own interests. And could it depend merely on America's intervention? And why could it not defend itself? That was the argument. Now, the Japanese constitution specifies that if you want to amend the constitution, you need a 2/3 majority in the upper house of parliament, you need an equal 2/3 majority in the lower house of parliament, you need to clear the amendment with a 2/3 majority in both these houses, and after that you need to go to the Japanese people for a referendum to ratify that amendment. So if Japan really wants to change Article 9 and say that no, we are going to have a military force, an active military force which is not purely defensive in nature, then the government would have to clear the amendment in both the houses of parliament and then hold a referendum. Now, what happened in the past few years? Shinzo Abe, during his term as the ruler, when he was in power, he pushed through one amendment in the year 2015. That amendment was that the Japanese forces, the self-defense forces, could be part of a collective self-defense force in the East. That meant that if, say, the islands around Japan were attacked or Japan's neighbors were attacked by Japan's enemies, and if that meant that Japan was directly under threat of attack, then Japan could be part of that collective self-defense force with that other country or batch of countries and engage in combat operations to beat back the aggressive force. Now, this was the first introduction of combat capability in a sense. So Shinzo took the first step in the direction of getting the Japanese forces involved in combat operations by ensuring that Japan got the power to be part of a group of countries which could engage in combat operations to beat back an aggressor and to beat back somebody who was a direct threat to Japan. Of course, the condition was that if that enemy was not thwarted, Japan would be under attack, and that had to be a certainty. But that clause was there, and nevertheless Japan got now the power to launch an attack in association with another country or a group of countries. The recent elections that happened, and I'm recording this in July 2022, soon after Shinzo Abe's assassination, were a test case for Shinzo Abe's party. Though he was out of power, they wanted to retain their majority in both houses of parliament. Now, Shinzo Abe had got a majority in the lower house and the upper house, but there were elections which would really test whether that majority would continue in the upper house. And those elections were scheduled in July 2022. And if his party could retain that 2/3 majority in the upper house, then with that majority and the majority in the lower house, they could in the near term future or in the short term or medium term, push for amendment of Article 9. Now, it so happened that we know that Shinzo Abe got assassinated. He was succeeded by Fumio Kishida as the ruler. But Fumio Kishida is rather Shinzo Abe's protege, and he's been placed in that position by Shinzo Abe. So he was going to follow in Shinzo Abe's footsteps, and that was why Shinzo Abe was campaigning so hard for the elections, that they wanted to retain that two-thirds majority. As it turns out, after Shinzo Abe's unfortunate assassination, that majority has been retained by the liberal Democrats, or the democratic liberals in Japan, and Fumio Kishida does have a two-thirds majority in both houses. Now the question is he going to risk a referendum? Now that's not such an easy question, because there have been various opinion polls in Japan over the years about whether the people are going to agree to a referendum, not just to a referendum, but to Japan again getting an active military. And opinions have been divided, and different opinion polls have thrown up different results. Some saying that the Japanese don't want a military, they are proud of their pacifist post-war charter, and some opinion polls saying no, things are moving in the direction of changing that policy. Now in the referendum, a two-thirds majority is not required. Only a simple majority, that is 50%, is required. But because of these conflicting opinion polls, it's going to be a political risk for any ruler or any premier or president to decide whether to go in for that referendum or not. So now Fumio Kishida has to decide whether he wants to go in for that referendum or not. Again, the argument continues that the security environment in the East has completely changed. The Japanese nation is facing all kinds of threats, and Shinzo Abe had really taken the lead in pushing for a new security architecture in the entire region. In fact, he was behind the creation of the Quad and the reinvigoration of the Quad as we know it. Two questions need to be answered now before we find out whether Japan will really change its constitution and get an active military or not. Those two questions are: one, will Fumio Kishida think that it's worth the political risk to go in for a referendum when the focus at the moment of recording this video at least is on rising prices in Japan and on strengthening Japan's economy in 2022? The second question that's going to be arising is, are the people really going to be in favor? And if that referendum does not work, if the people vote against it, it will be a major loss of face for the government, and it will give a lot of ammunition to the opponents of the democratic liberals, opponents which are both on the left, and the right. Interestingly, both the opponents of remilitarization on both sides of the ideological divide cite the United States as the reason for their opposition. One party, which is to the left, says that if we remilitarize or have a new active military, then America will involve Japan in all sorts of wars, not only in the neighborhood but elsewhere as well. For instance, in 2003, when the Iraq war started, the Japanese self-defense force became part of the peacekeeping force in Iraq after the hostilities began and when rebuilding started. Now the Japanese self-defense force has a peculiar character. It cannot be part of the combat operations, or it could not be until 2015, but it could go and be part of peace building efforts elsewhere. So it had gone as part of the peace building effort in Iraq after that war came to an end, or after civil war broke out and things were in a complete mess there. So the left is arguing that America's hold over, or alleged hold over, Japan will grow, and the extreme right is also arguing that America will then control Japan's forces, and it's best not to have an active military and get entangled too much in all sorts of conflicts where it's not necessary. At the same time, the whole security environment has changed completely since the start of the 21st century, and it's a decision for the Japanese government to take whether Article 9 of the Constitution stays or not, particularly in the wake of the Chinese threat in the east, and also in the wake of North Korea's activities in the neighborhood. Thank you. I hope you liked this video. If you liked it, do comment, subscribe to my channel, my YouTube channel, and press the bell button so that you get a notification every time a new video is uploaded. Thank you so much.